So I'd like to formally welcome you all to this seminar of the Melbourne Feminist History Group on Transgender History. I'm one of the conveners of the group, Dr. Adrien from La Trobe University. And we've got two of our other conveners here tonight, Professor Katie Holmes and Dr. Tim Jones, also both from La Trobe. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're all on stolen Aboriginal land. I'm on the stolen and unceded land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders past and present. Wurundjeri sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It's a great pleasure to finish our year of seminars, our somewhat COVID-disrupted year of seminars, with a panel tonight on transgender history, featuring two papers coming from the Transgender Histories Discovery Project, being run at the Australian Catholic University under the leadership of Professor Noah Riseman, who's with us tonight. So this project, which has been running for the last few years, aims to trace the emergence of transgender identities in Australia since the early 20th century. And it's really the first of its kind in Australia. Transgender history has been a kind of fairly thriving field internationally, particularly in the United States in recent years, but it's really wonderful to see it kind of get this concerted funding within Australia. So our two speakers tonight, as mentioned, will be Professor Noah Riseman, who's the author of many books on military, LGBT and Indigenous history. And we'll also hear first, in fact, from Adrien McCrory, who's doing a PhD with Noah at ACU. We're also working on this Transgender Australians project. And we'll run it similarly to how we've run the last two Zoom seminars. So we'll take brief questions after each paper, and then to kind of draw out particular points from those papers, and then we'll have a longer discussion at the end. And the formal proceedings will end about 7. We'll stop recording then. But, you know, as we've been discussing, the great thing about Zoom seminars is, you know, they can be very accessible and bring in people from outside of the geographical area, but you also lose that social element. So we're going to leave on the Zoom without recording for a few minutes at the end if anyone wants to stay and have a chat. So I'll hand over now to our first speaker, Adrien McCrory, whose talk is entitled Offensive Behaviour and Public Spectacle, the Policing of Male Masqueraders in 1900s to 1930s Victoria. Thank you, Adrien.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Eve, and thank you for having me. I'll just quickly share my screen. There we go. Sorry, just give me one moment. Alrighty, so just to get started, I'd also like to quickly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking today, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I recognise that we are on stolen land and acknowledge the sorrow of the stolen generations and that sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So today, oh, sorry, I'm just going to quickly change my screen a little bit. Sorry, there we go. So today I'll be discussing the policing of male masqueraders. So that is people assigned male at birth who wore female clothing in Victoria from the turn of the 20th century to the end of the 1930s. So this topic is an aspect of my PhD research project, where I'm looking at the ways that trans and gender diverse people have interacted with the criminal justice system across the course of the 20th century. So in terms of methodology, this period of my research focuses primarily on archival materials from Trove and the Public Records Office of Victoria, as well as the State Library for newspapers which haven't been digitised in Trove. Unfortunately, both Trove and the State Library are currently closed due to COVID, which means that I'm working currently with the records that I accessed prior to lockdown. But I do expect that the cases that I'm discussing today, I will be able to expand on further once archives reopen. So what do I mean when I say male masqueraders? So I use the term masquerading in my research for this period as it was a common term in the late 19th and early 20th century to refer to cases of people presenting in public as a gender different from the one that they're assigned at birth. So masquerading could take a range of different forms and encompass a lot of different types of gender performance, which were all policed differently. So from our perspective in the present, it's impossible to really assign any sort of modern gender identity onto most of the individuals involved in masquerading cases, especially those cases that we encounter looking back over records from the legal system and the press. So criminal justice institutions or the media would write these records documenting these cases, and they rarely provide us much insight into a person's own identity. So when I say male masquerader, I'm referring to people who would generally be assigned male at birth, presenting as female, usually in public. And it's an imperfect term, but it's one which encompasses a range of behaviours lumped together in this turn of phrase and sort of policed accordingly. So to put it in a modern framework, some male masqueraders may have been cisgender men dressing up for fun, some may have been transgender women presenting in a way which aligned with their own gender identity, some masqueraders may have considered themselves sort of in a modern term sort of non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming, and some may have been masquerading for entirely different reasons than those that I've mentioned. But for almost all, we'll never really know for sure. But what we can learn from them is an insight into how police, public media, and the criminal justice institutions responded to gender nonconformity, and what this policing can then tell us about public perceptions and anxieties around gender and gender nonconformity. So for my purposes, I'll be using they, them pronouns to refer to the individuals that I discuss, except where I'm quoting directly from other documentation, sort of acknowledging the fact that I don't really have any information, enough information to assign them any other pronouns with certainty. So I'll be looking at the ways in which policing of male masqueraders changed over the first few decades of the 20th century today. Lucy Chess's work, particularly her book Parting with My Sex, has been very influential to my research. So Chess's work focuses on gender crossing in the late 19th and the early 20th century. And some of the cases that she explores I also look at in my own work. However, Chess's work, although she does sometimes touch on crime, doesn't really focus on the criminal justice response to these individuals, which is the focus of my own research. So across this period, masquerading cases rose in prominence as new ideas about sexual deviance, gender nonconformity, and homosexuality entered the public discourse. And I'll be looking at these ideas and the ways that male masquerading cases were framed both before and after the discourses really took hold, and the ways that they were sort of reinterpreted to formulate a new archetype of a gender non-conforming person who is later characterized by sexual deviance and criminalized because of it. So as a side note as well, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm not looking at female masqueraders, so that is female assigned people who are presenting as male in public in this paper, but it is something that I look at in my broader research, and it's a very interesting discussion in its own right as well. So to start by discussing masquerading at the turn of the 20th century, cross-gender performances were popular on stage across Australia throughout the 19th and early 20th century. On stage, men could perform in female roles in either comedic or serious performances at a professional or at an amateur level. However, the acceptability of these masquerades was limited to the context of this performance. So for the first 2 decades of the 20th century, arrests of male masqueraders were less frequently reported on than those of female masqueraders, and it's not possible to identify most of these cases on the court records themselves, as they blend in with other offensive behaviour or vagrancy charges. Therefore, what we rely on the press to report these cases and what they consider to be relevant to the public interest. It's also possible that some masquerades simply didn't result in arrest if they were interpreted sufficiently as entertainment, performance, or costume, or if they weren't detected at all. But whatever the case, the outcome is the same. Male masquerades took up a relatively small portion of available records for the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Most arrests for masquerades, both male and female, came under either vagrancy or offensive or indecent behaviour laws. Both these laws function to regulate public spaces. They were broad in their applications, and they were used by police to target the poor, the working class, the idle, the homeless, or anyone behaving in ways considered publicly indecent or immoral. So police managed public spaces by targeting these criminal types or these classes of people through the patrolling of beats, so male cruising spaces, and through the utilisation of public order offence charges. And this was a deliberate system of policing public crimes against morality or decency to regulate and criminalise what constituted public morality. So during the 1900s to the 1910s, the same acts conducted in private, while they may have been viewed negatively, fell outside of the scope of policing in a sort of unenthusiastic tolerance that if they were kept hidden, the acts didn't need to be punished. Meanwhile, the policing of homosexuality, which was also used against trans or gender non-conforming individuals, was based primarily on criminalizing individual acts such as sodomy. And throughout the 19th century, sodomy was sort of considered an abominable crime, sort of something that was indecent to even speak about. But the criminalization of individual sex acts was not yet itself sort of attached to a coherent idea of homosexuality as an identity, and this would come later. So male masquerading cases were still considered dangerous on a moral and sexual level to the public. The discrepancy between how female and male masqueraders were charged is sort of evidence of this. Both public order offences, so that is both vagrancy and offensive behaviour, focused on regulating public spaces, decency and morality. Vagrancy charges were primarily used to charge female masqueraders, while police usually used offensive behaviour charges for male masqueraders. Broadly, vagrancy charges were used as a catch-all tool by police to charge people for being poor or socially non-compliant. Offensive behaviour charges, however, were more concerned with individual conduct and with sexuality. The vagrant as a concept didn't exclude those perceived as men, but the associated archetypes were different for men and for women. Vagrant individuals of both genders represented sort of moral threats to public order. Vagrant women were seen as unattached, out of the control of husbands or fathers, and were considered a threat to the good moral order of public life. By contrast, vagrant men posed a threat to industry and bourgeois society, as well as a perceived physical threat. So a vagrant man was someone who failed to live up to this sort of industrious, respectable gendered ideal, and masquerading ran counter to this ideal and was sort of therefore a different offence, so indecent or offensive behaviour. The offensiveness of this behaviour for male masqueraders was seen to have a sexual element. For masqueraders to protest the charges and assert their innocence, they were required to rebuke the sexual connotations of the masquerade. So this meant emphasising a comedic or a theatrical motivation. A masquerade might be seen to have an illicit homosexual sort of subtext from the side of the men encountering the masquerade or from the masquerader themselves. So this ambiguity meant that even comedic or theatrical performances, which were sort of safe, could still be questionable if the masquerade was too convincing. If a male masquerader's presentation was too effective, it raised concerns about homosexual attraction towards them. If a masquerader was too invested in their own performance, so if they were sort of seen to be enjoying it too much, this made their motivations questionable, and they might themselves be seen as sexually or gender deviant. The most common argument that a masquerader could make in their defence, with mixed success, was one which brought the masquerade in line with other acceptable theatrical performances. Masqueraders generally said that they were dressing up for fun or for a joke, or to attend fancy dress events. And I'll briefly go over a couple of examples and discuss the justice system's responses, as well as public responses from the press. So an example of this kind of defence can be seen in the 1908 case of Douglas Ogilvie, Thomas Page and Alan McHale, who were arrested on offensive behaviour charges following an appearance at the Vienna Cafe on Collins Street, where they were dressed in female clothing. So Ogilvie, Page and McHale went out on a September evening. They were originally intending to attend a fancy dress ball, and they were dressed as Mother Goose, Mary Widow and the Gibson Girl. However, they were denied entrance and instead went to the cafe where they attracted a crowd. By the time the police arrived and arrested the three of them, at least one had been roughly handled by the crowd and their clothing had been torn. The prosecutor for the case said that Ogilvie, Page and McHale were either sexual perverts or brainless young idiots, and much of the court case was occupied with determining which of the two they were. So the defence claimed that there was no evidence that the three of them had behaved in an improper or indecent manner, and he stated, "Their disguise was obvious. If they could not go to a fancy dress ball in female costume, the university students in procession and characters at the 8 hours demonstration were also illegal." So this comparison of the masquerade to the 8 hours fete goes back to that tension and inconsistency between where masquerades were performed as public amusements and were therefore acceptable versus when they were deviant or immoral. So in the context of a fete, a fancy dress ball or similar, people could push the limits of acceptable public dress and behaviour with more freedom than they could elsewhere. So Ogilvy, Page and McHale's case ended with a discharge. While the police warned that they were treading on thin ice, there was no law against an individual wearing the opposite gender's clothing, and as they had not acted improperly while they were in their masquerade, they could not be charged with any offence. In another instance, in 1915, a young person named Frank Johnson Ennis was arrested in Ballarat for going out smartly dressed in a coat and skirt, a fur necklet, a becoming hat and veil, and women's shoes with their friends. So Ennis was arrested and charged with offensive behaviour also. And although they claimed they had also intended the masquerade as a joke, they were fined £2 over the event, unlike in the previous case. So reporting around Ennis's case focused on the fact that they were able to present themselves effortlessly as a woman, with observers being none the wiser until they revealed themselves. They moved through a number of shops and hotels before they were identified, and it wasn't until Ennis revealed their identity at the second hotel they visited that they were caught and arrested. So interestingly, the charge under which Ennis was arrested was not identified in any of the reporting, and the press simply stated that they were arrested for having masqueraded as a woman. So this does imply a sort of underlying assumption that despite the lack of any explicit law regarding wearing another gender's clothing, to go out and masquerade without an accepted reason was understood as being criminal by the general public. In some way. So Ennis argued that the masquerade was a joke, in line with the defence used in other cases. However, the explanation was not accepted by the court. Perhaps because Ennis's level of seamless presentation and their ability to move through public space undetected increased the level of sort of perceived danger that their masquerade posed. So Ogilvy, Page and McHale were able to be interpreted in line with sort of performance, amusement and spectacle, although questionably so. Ennis's masquerade was not obvious enough to receive the same treatment. So the way, moving on to the 1920s and the 40s, the way that male masquerading was understood began to shift by the beginning of the 20s and more solidly by the 1930s and 40s. So far we've looked at a couple of cases from the first 2 decades of the 20th century, which were defined primarily by this appeal to the kinds of acceptable masquerading which were popular as entertainment during the period. The key shift following this period was that gender non-conforming presentations, such as masquerading, began to become associated with this developing concept of sexual deviance. So Australian discourses in the 20s and the 30s drew from the British and continental field of sexology. In the broader field of medicine, sexologists were scientifically investigating and reasoning sexual behaviour and creating categories of homosexuality and inversion in the early decades of the 20th century. But these ideas didn't really become dominant or very present in Australia until the 1930s and 40s. So sexologists linked gender nonconformance to sexual deviance, but criminal justice institutions in Australia rarely drew directly from these academic fields. Instead, they drew from the ideas which had entered mainstream discourse as a result of these categorizations. So this idea of the sexually deviant person as an archetype who is characterized by homosexuality, deviance, and gender nonconformity. And this was a shift from earlier ideas of sort of male same-sex sexual activity in particular, which primarily targeted the acts themselves. So as the medical field defined this category of sort of the homosexual, the focus shifted away from individual forms of intercourse, such as sodomy, and instead came to encompass sort of a whole person whose sexuality influenced every aspect of their behavior and their psychology. So through the 1930s, the medicalization of homosexuality as sexual and gender-inverted sort of deviance found its way into sentencing and the courtrooms. In New South Wales in the 1910s, only 1% of defendants facing charges related to homosexual activity were placed under medical observation after their time in court, but by the 1930s, this had risen to 10%. Likewise, by the 1930s, policing of offences related to male homosexual activity had also risen. However, the charges themselves were less serious. So most arrests were under offensive or indecent behaviour, vagrancy, soliciting for immoral purposes, and indecent exposure, rather than sodomy or buggery, which carried much more severe penalties. So this conceptualization of the sort of deviant person as a category of individual also shifted the way that gender nonconformity was policed. So the masquerader was no longer considered a threat only to decency and morality within public spaces, but also in their private activities, and could be policed accordingly. So this meant that police were more likely to target masquerades which occurred outside of the public eye, so in people's private residences, in hotels, and so forth. So an example of policing which blurred the line of public and private in this way is the arrest of Percy Douglas. So in 1932, Douglas was found in bed by police at 12:45 a.m. In their room at the Victoria Coffee Palace on Little Collins Street. So police arrested Douglas wearing women's pajamas to bed, and they had only female clothing and lingerie in their room with them. The police charged Douglas with offensive behaviour, and according to reports, Douglas had not spoken to any person, man or woman in Melbourne, except to give their order to a waitress for food, at which point their voice betrayed them. So Douglas did not intend their masquerade to be a public spectacle. Douglas himself seemed to be a very isolated individual. As per their statement in court, they lived on a 300-acre farm outside of Bannockburn, where they tended to livestock and they didn't see any other human beings. While on the farm, they dressed in feminine attire, with their stated motivation being that they were doing a silly crank, and that they had obtained a few theatrical properties, putting on amateur theatre in England, prior to moving to Australia. So Douglas explained that they wanted to see if they could maintain this masquerade while they visited Melbourne for the weekend, just to entertain themselves. Although there was clearly a public element to Douglas's masquerade, so at least enough for them to be identified and for the police to be called on them, most of their masquerading seemed to be characterized by the sort of privacy and interiority. So their stated motivations were personal, in that they masqueraded primarily alone in an isolated location, and their arrest took place in the privacy of their room and in the middle of the night. So indicating that at least at the time of the arrest, they weren't creating any kind of public disturbance. In court, Douglas explained their masquerade with the language of performance and amusement, but no audience except for Douglas themselves seemed to be present. Using the rationale of performance indicates that this did remain a common line of defence as it had been in prior decades, even in cases where it appeared counterintuitive. So their offensive behaviour charge was less about any disruption or insult caused by their masquerade, and was much more focused on the offence innate in male assigned person habitually dressing in female clothing as was perceived. So some reporting identified the charge itself, again, not as offensive behaviour, but as being a male who walked abroad in female attire, making it clear that it was the gender transgression itself that was what was being policed. So Douglas's case was ultimately discharged in court with a warning. The police and the court seemed to see Douglas's private masquerade as criminal enough to warrant arrest, although apparently not quite criminal enough to warrant a fine or time in prison. And Douglas also agreed to comply with the judge's requirement that they resume wearing masculine clothing. And this, along with the sort of lack of any evidence that they engaged in any other deviant behaviour, whether criminal or sexual, may have also factored into why they were discharged. For public arrests, the change in discourses around gender nonconformity as evidence of sexual deviance still shaped how cases were perceived. So for an example of this, there's Roy Bellamy or Minnie Mackenzie, which is the name that they went by during their masquerade, the one that I'll use to refer to them, who was arrested in 1937 on a vagrancy charge for masquerading in women's clothing on Flemington Road. So Mackenzie was sentenced to 6 months in prison, a sentence which reflected how they were perceived by police and the courts. So they were seen as someone who was sexually deviant and disreputable. So Mackenzie was known to police, who considered them a reputed thief who associated with men who masqueraded as women, and who was known for pirating or propositioning men and accompanying them to the nearby gardens, which were likely a beat. So for Mackenzie, their masquerade was evidence to the press and to the criminal justice system of their deviant character. Police arrested Mackenzie frequently. They have 3 arrests for 1937 alone on their record, as well as others for other years. However, they only seemed to make the press when associated with a masquerading charge. So this sort of demonstrated that to the justice system, their criminality made their masquerade more dangerous, but to the press, their masquerade is what made their criminality newsworthy. So just in conclusion, sort of as the common understanding of gender nonconformity shifted over the first 4 decades of the 20th century, the focus of policing shifted along with it. So gender nonconformity sort of became part of an archetype of a sexually deviant person, becoming not only a public disturbance or spectacle, but evidence of an internal sexual or gender divergence. So this meant that policing of gender nonconformity was no longer limited only to public realms and concerned primarily with the public offence or disruption that it could cause. Instead, policing also moved into private spaces as well, because the moral danger that a gender non-conforming person was seen to pose no longer sort of ended at their front door. Now that their gender non-conformity was part of sort of this perceived deviant internal identity and character, they were always considered a moral danger wherever they were.
Thank you, Adrien.
Thank you.
That was fascinating and very sad as well.
Yeah, it's not particularly a happy topic.
Yeah, no. Do we have any questions for Adrien in regards to his paper before we move on to Noah? You can raise your hand virtually or literally.
I can't find the raise hand reaction anymore. Gone. I do have a question. It's about the female masqueraders. Sorry to, move the discussion away from your main topic. There was it seen as more socially appropriate for people who are assigned female at birth to dress as men if it was for an employment opportunity or perhaps a chance to go soldiering?
Yes, so from what I can see, it seemed to be sort of a lot more accepted generally for sort of what they would term female masqueraders to go out dressed in male clothing, particularly for finding employment, finding work and this sort of thing. It depended a lot on the class of the person and sort of other criminal associations that they had. So for people who were sort of seen as habitually criminal or vagrant or things like that, it wasn't seen quite so positively or acceptably. And it also depended quite a lot on age. So like young people were sort of just seen to be quite, fun and going out and having an adventure and things like that. Whereas the older you were, the less it was sort of accepted, and it was more likely as well, sort of younger people tended to be charged with sort of vagrancy and older people sort of tended to be charged with offensive behaviour as opposed to sort of showing the sort of, as people got older, it was sort of considered less acceptable. But for young female assigned people in particular, there was this sort of, I guess, heroine sort of figure that was sometimes associated with it, particularly if they were considered respectable or otherwise sort of, non-criminal. But for people who were seen as lower class, it was less accepted. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions, Adrien? Yeah, Tim?
Great paper, Adrien.
Thank you.
Did you find any examples of assigned male at birth people masquerading as women living in relationships? There are notable cases of male impersonators, as they were called, getting married or living in relationships, but I haven't come across cases of the other.
That's a good question, actually. I haven't come across any myself either. No, I actually haven't come across any sort of like that. But as you're saying, it is quite common to see the reverse. The sort of idea of the female husband sort of crops up quite a lot, particularly in this period. But yeah, no, I haven't seen any examples of that.
Thanks. We might move on to Noah's paper now, just so we stay on time, but we'll have time for more discussion at the end. So thank you again, Adrien. Yes. Now we're going to hear, we're moving forward in time, further in the 20th century, on Professor Noah Riseman, who is talking on finding evidence of me through evidence of us, transgender oral histories and personal archives.
There's the unmute button. Thanks so much, Eve, and thanks, Adrien, for getting us started. I'd also just acknowledge that I'm also beaming to you from Wurundjeri and Bunurong land. I'm actually just down the road from Adrien. and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also just in the spirit of both of our papers tonight, also acknowledge the long histories of gender diversity in Indigenous communities, including all the sister girls and brother boys out there today. So this isn't a traditional paper that I'm used to giving. It's a bit more methodological, a bit more reflective, and a bit speculative, dare I say, and an opportunity to try and tease out some of the observations that were actually really unexpected aspects of the research journey that I've taken in this project. So I'm drawing a little bit on our archive studies theory and some of the examples of people whom I've interviewed. Some of this is material that for a book chapter I'm working on. Some of it's material for an article that's just been accepted into Gender and History. And by the way, if either of the referees are here, thank you so much for your really helpful suggestions. But I want to start briefly with Dr. Julie Peters, who I think is actually here with us tonight as well. I sometimes feel like a broken record because I quite regularly bring Julie into these talks, and many of you will have seen the Archive Fever episode that Julie and I both did with Eve and with Claire Wright. So I'm actually not going to spend too much time on Julie this time. But the reason that I'm bringing Julie into this discussion, and I quite regularly do, is she's actually the inspiration for the ideas that I've been exploring about personal archives and transgender people. Just the very basic background to Julie. She's been a founding member of Melbourne's first transgender support group, Seahorse Victoria, back in 1975. She transitioned while working at the ABC in the 80s. In 1996, she was the first openly trans person to run for the Australian Parliament when she ran for the Democrats in then Batman. She founded the Victorian Transgender Rights Lobby in 1997. She was the first openly trans person to run for the Victorian Parliament in 98. She's been a co-convener of Transgender Victoria. She's an artist, a poet, a writer, a singer, a performer. And in 2016, she completed a PhD, which was in autoethnography grounded in gender studies. And for decades, Julie has been a very prominent, I'd even say uniting figure amongst many different factions, for lack of a better word, within Victoria's LGBT and T communities. Now, when I interviewed Julie a few years ago, why did that not change slides? There we go. When I interviewed Julie a few years ago, she brought a folder of documents to our interview, which included copies of some government inquiries that she'd been part of, some newspaper articles about her, and the election campaign poster I had on that previous one, and some copies of her writings that she'd done in the 1990s. And this was something that Julie said at the very beginning of our interview.
I've collected so much stuff, and I would estimate I've got 5 or 6 filing cabinets of sort of trans bits and pieces. Some of them just articles out of newspapers, some were my reactions to things, and some of it does include my writing.
So I was privileged that Julie then kindly invited me to spend one day a month for the rest of the year to comb through those records, and her treasure trove was just absolutely amazing. Personal records going back as far as childhood report cards from the 50s, letters, correspondence between her and other trans women dating back to the 70s, newspaper and magazine clippings about anything related to transgender or gender nonconformity dating back to the 60s, records from various community groups she was involved in. And what's really important, I mean, she had these records from organizations that we know very little about, like the Victorian Transsexual Coalition that existed from 1979 till about 1985. But Julie was a starting point. She's not unique in keeping such an extensive personal archive. 2 weeks after I interviewed Julie, I interviewed transgender advocate Catherine Cummings, who is the author of the award-winning book, Catherine's Diary. And Catherine and Julie know each other. And when I told Catherine about Julie's 6 filing cabinets, she very calmly said to me, "I have 9. Now, several other interview participants from across Australia have been so generous in sharing personal archives. They've ranged from everything from musical compositions to organizational records from various community groups to these really highly cataloged records like Julie had. And I have to say it helped that 2 of the people I interviewed are librarians by trade. So what I want to go through today is just some of the types of material that were kept in various people's personal archives, what they can tell us about trans history, but also think about this question: why have so many of these trans people, these remarkable people, preserved so much material? And what does that suggest about their identity formations and about trans history in general? So personal archives, looking at archival theory, it's actually on the periphery of archive studies, but there is growing interest from revisionist scholars in the field. The human drive to create records is at the heart of any archive, whether it's an institutional one, a community one, or a personal one. Sue McCamish described this drive to save personal archives with this term, evidence of me. where she wrote in 96, a personal archive records individuals in their personal capacity capture as evidence of these roles and activities, evidence of me. Building on McCamish, Catherine Hobbs explains that personal archives function as the site of multiple constructs, of a person upholding and struggling with ideas, of self and of others, while simultaneously contradicting, convincing, and contriving. Within the context of this fluidity of personality, we are not quite finding evidence of me, but rather of the essential moving target of human life being enacted. So this drive to find and to preserve evidence of me, it's inevitably about situating the individual within the broader discourses and the broader events and organizational histories. Evidence me, it's like an archival version to an extent of the oral history concept of composure. So just as interview participants compose their memories around the language, the identities, the discourses, the narratives available to them, so too do personal archives reflect an ongoing dialogue between this evidence of me and evidence of us. And the historian's role is to try and collate the oral and the written evidence, the numerous evidence of me's, to produce a collective history of us. So many of the transgender people I interviewed, the types of records they preserved were very much about finding evidence of me during eras when discussions about gender identity or transgender identity were few and far between. So a lot of the older interview participants who were young people in the 1970s or the 80s often talked about television or magazines or radio and these sort of moments where they heard a term or they first saw or witnessed the word trans. They wouldn't have said transgender then, the outdated term transsexual, or I won't even say the other one. But I think this quote from Bronwyn, so Bronwyn was an anonymous interview, so I won't play the audio, but I think is a really, talks about around age 11 when an issue of Clio arrived at her house, which had the word transsexualism on the cover. She said, "My mind was ready to receive some word that could attach itself to what was already going on in mind. And the moment I saw that word transsexualism, that was it. I just knew straight away, before even opening the magazine, I thought, my God, that's got to be something about me." In 2002, Peter Ringo published the first study which examined the relationship between media and trans people's identity formation, and he referred to these as identity events. Ringo found that diverse media, anything from television to internet to films, drag performances, autobiographies, they all played a role in Ringo's interview participants' identification as trans men. That's what Ringo was working with. And Ringo concluded that, quote, "Media's role can be understood as having encouraged its users qualities of transness to manifest and strengthen, to become organized under the purview of identity, and to mature through the processes of physical, social, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual transition." Now, some of the trans people that I've interviewed collected newspaper and magazine articles and preserved this as evidence of me. Julie is one example. She, over the years and still to this day, every time she come across an article relating to gender nonconformity or trans issues, she's cut it out and saved it. In her interview, she said, this was the way I was sort of trying to understand it being gender identity. A few other examples, one I've got some excerpts from here. These are from a collection of old newspapers and magazines that were cut out and put into 41 scrapbooks with clippings from the mainstream and the LGBTI press about gender nonconformity, drag, transgender, that date back to the 1960s through to the early 2000s. The maker of these scrapbooks donated them to the Queensland AIDS Council, and then in late 2019 had them transferred to the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives. Now look, just from a pure primary sources point of view, these notebooks are absolutely amazing. They include clippings from the mainstream media, which are during that era that Trove and Factiva and other databases don't capture, so that would be really hard to search. They also have a lot from the LGBTI press, which until the beginning of this year, when that amazing Archives of Sexuality and Gender database included a lot of ALGA material, a lot of that stuff was also not searchable. There's other stuff in the collection besides scrapbooks. There's also magazines, videotapes, a lot of trans pornography, which is, I think, an interesting angle for other stuff, another site of visibility. Now, but what's interesting also is thinking about these scrapbooks, though. An article in 1996 by Ruth Ford talked about scrapbooks as valuable sources for historians of sexuality. And thank you to referee number 2, if you are here, for pointing me to this article. Because Ford argued that in eras of little lesbian visibility, scrapbooks were one way that women often explored popular representations of gender and women's sexuality, and they were a way that women who were same-sex attracted could sort of explore ideas around this by collecting scrapbooks. And these scrapbooks, again, these are not unique either. Joanne Meyerowitz, who's done research on trans history in the United States, has found examples of scrapbooks that people collected with news clippings about Christine Jurgensen's transition in the early 1950s, some of which are now available in the Kinsey Institute. So through the oral histories I've done, media wasn't the only site where transgender people were searching for evidence of me. Jonathan Pare, who he wanted to be here tonight, but because of daylight savings, he's up in Brisbane now. He's still at work, so he couldn't come. But Jonathan was one of Victoria's first trans male activists. And he was studying an associate diploma in community development at Victoria University from 93 to 95. And he spoke in his interview really enthusiastically about how one assignment really changed his life.
I had been stealth. I was in an environment where we were being encouraged to advocate and empower, and all of those words from the 90s. And I ended up doing this first round of research, which was the experiences of being transgender, personal, community, and societal perspectives, and it was an action research project.
Okay.
And that was one of our assessment requirements. Did the research, and from there, of course, we're learning about support groups and setting up groups and supporting groups and advocating on behalf of groups. And from a community development perspective, you should be part of the community that you're actually working in. And so from this, Transgender Liberation and Care got set up.
So Jonathan completed this assignment in November 94, and in May 95, he did found Transgender Liberation and Care, which is Victoria's first peer support group, which was inclusive of all gender diverse people. And incidentally, Julie's personal archive has the invitation and a copy of the invitation to the very first meeting. And TLC was around until about 2002, and one of its many legacies is Transgender Victoria was actually sort of in many ways a spin-off from this group. Now, Jonathan's research and his writing process for that 1994 assignment brought him into contact with a critical reference group of 10 other trans men and women in Melbourne. And he actually found that evidence of me through this shared evidence of us, which he wrote up into this report, which was called The Experiences of Being Transgender, Personal, Community, and Social Consequences. Jonathan saved this report and another one he wrote for that assignment, and he very kindly gave me copies of these. He even gave permission for one of my colleagues to assign these actually as readings for a class for people to understand some of the sort of ideas around gender and gender diversity circa 1994. This is just a quote from the opening of Jonathan's report. This research project worked with members of the transgender community, not to ponder the issues of why people are transgender, but to recognize and validate transgender experiences and to assist in the development of a core group of individuals able and committed to developing a sustainable, community-based support system for current and future transgender individuals. Now, I should say, in many ways, reading these documents, they feel very much ahead of their time. Many ideas about gender and gender identity that I think are much more common today, but they were only emerging in the 1990s. For instance, in one of these reports, Jonathan talks about androgyny, was the term he was using at the time, and he said, "This theory may provide an enlightening framework for transgender individuals as it encourages the development and use of gender flexibility, which allows individuals to display masculine and or feminine behaviors as is appropriate to the situation and to the individual. This would give all individuals, not only transgender individuals, a great deal of freedom to explore the diversity within themselves and to be proud of such diversity rather than disown or hide it as it does not fit into the socially defined gender stereotype." So, that's very much what we would think about today when we talk about gender fluidity or non-binary, instead of that more outdated term androgyny. But it's really interesting, these ideas were there. They were coming from the transgender community in 1994. And this was a sort of being documented, and Jonathan has saved these for over 25 years as part of his journey of evidence of me through evidence of us. I'm short on time, but just really quickly, this was just a really distinct example. Margaret Jones is a musician, a music teacher, and in their interview, they shared a musical piece that they composed back in 1977 when they were 16 years old. It was a very somber musical piece. They called it Androgyne Prophecy. Well, they didn't call it that at the time. I'll play this quote from our interview describing it.
It was year 11 in high school, so it was long before that. But it wasn't called Androgyne Prophecy at the time, which had some generic title. But that was definitely what it was about. Because in my mind, it was thinking ahead to my life as an androgyne.
So androgyne, I mean, it's an older term. In my interview with Margaret, it's the only time I've really come across it. But if you look it up on, say, Urban Dictionary or some other spaces, it is sort of about a gender fluid or a non-binary or multi-gender even individual. And that's a way that Margaret often has identified themselves. So that's why that word androgyne and androgyne prophecy is so important to them. After I finish the formal talk and stop sharing my screen, I can click you a link to the YouTube where Margaret plays Androgyne Prophecy. And in 2018, Margaret, finally years later, added lyrics to it. Just some excerpts from those lyrics. Dread was my friend and was my constant companion. Doubt always there, always gnawing at my soul. Who was I? Was I not a boy, not a girl, something else? Know thyself, know the truth. Wise words, but how would I live? Man or woman, how do you define them? I tried, we all tried, and failed. Questions are wrong when they aim for an answer, because we all have our own gender self. When the veil lifts, at last we'll see the truth. Then the world will know, will understand our love. So just to wrap this up, I've really only grazed the surface today of the sorts of personal archives I've encountered for this project. So in addition to giving us access to media from eras where it otherwise wouldn't be accessible, and the very personal records that people have kept, these personal archives have been vital at recovering information about transgender and other community groups where there was otherwise little or no other surviving trace in the institutional archives. So, I mean, just to throw out some examples, Kayleen White, who was one of the co-founders of Transgender Victoria, had some of the old documents that TGV used to lobby for anti-discrimination reform in 1999 and 2000. Jenny Scott, who's based in Adelaide and is one of those librarians I spoke about, she has so many records from a lot of really small groups from the 1990s to 2000s that she was involved in both trans activism and other LGBT issues. This photo up here is, sorry, at the top, this is a photo someone sent me a few weeks ago. I haven't interviewed this person yet, but they did give me permission to share the photo. It's of their garage and their personal archive that they haven't organized yet, but they're gonna organize it between now and when the restrictions lift, and then we're gonna go through it together and do an interview to talk a bit about some of the organizations that they've been involved in. And I should say also, I did clear with Jonathan and with Julie and with Margaret permission to use these quotes and images beforehand, especially because this is being recorded. So look, these are just some of the examples of the ways that some of the trans people I've interviewed have found evidence of me through evidence of us, or also preserved evidence of us through evidence of me in history. And I think this quote from Jonathan, I always think it's good to give them the last word. So this quote from Jonathan is the way I'll end on.
I think it's really important for the community to know its history and to have something documented. I think it's also really important for the individuals that will get mentioned, because a lot of us have bled for this, and I think a lot of us feel that we've just been abandoned and disregarded, and that a lot of younger people coming through are taking it all for granted and they're not interested.
Okay, I'll finish it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noah. That was absolutely fascinating as well. I so enjoyed hearing about Julie's personal archive at length last year when we were doing the archive interview. So it's so great to kind of see how that has, you've expanded that research and looking at so many different personal archives and thinking about them sort of theoretically.
You're inspirational, Julie.
Yeah. Although, most of my friends basically said, why are you keeping all that junk? So I really,
listen to them.
I was really pleased to meet people who appreciated it.
Exactly. And I was thinking actually, Noah, as you were talking about the scrapbook as a medium to kind of collate, evidence of people, like me. I suppose this is actually a question I'd like to ask you. Is it, do you think that, like, I suppose for me, you know, as a trans person myself, what immediately kind of came to mind as the contemporary equivalent is things like kind of Instagram and Tumblr and other ways to kind of curate and, you know, search for people like, you know, like me to try and find kind of a sense of community. Would you agree with that kind of thinking?
100%. What's really interesting is when I was doing my previous project on LGBTI people in defense, I interviewed about a dozen trans people who served in the defense force, and all bar one of them had transitioned in the 2000s. And every single one of them had said that when they were having these feelings, they didn't really understand them, they all went to the internet. And a big question I kept thinking, well, what the hell did people do before the internet? And I think this was one way, not the only way, but certainly one way. And I have noticed, even if people didn't necessarily preserve a scrapbook or preserve all the articles the same way Julie did, one thing that really did catch me pleasantly, like I didn't expect as a finding, was a lot of people who were young people in the 1970s or 80s mentioned a specific TV program or mentioned a specific magazine or a specific newspaper. Like there was specific mention of seeing this term or this term transsexual or something else, and then there was this sort of, that's what I've been experiencing. So, I mean, obviously not everyone preserved it all, but certainly it was a way of putting into words what many people were feeling.
Yeah, well, as you were giving the paper, and just then I also was thinking of that new Netflix documentary Disclosure about trans representation in TV and film, which kind of, has so many trans people interviewed saying that, like that they, as children, kind of having this inchoate sense that something was a bit different about them, seeing transsexual characters on screen and having this really intense moment of recognition. So do we have any questions for Noah? Katie?
Yeah, thanks, Noah, and also Adrien, for really interesting papers. I'm struck by the really different nature of the archives that you're both using. You know, one, the public state archive looking at criminal records, and one, you know, a privately curated personal archive. It's really easy to think about all the silences in the criminal archive and the state archive. But Noah, I'm wondering about the silences in the kind of archives that you're looking at and using, and what's not there, and how might you reflect on that?
I love that question, and I don't know if I can answer that justice right now. It's a great question. I'd start by saying these are obviously aren't the only things I'm using. I mean, I'm also using what we might call institutional archives, be they, you know, the National Archives has records of examples of people writing in to politicians, or sometimes in there. There's court records of, you know, fights for legal recognition. So, I mean, these aren't the only archives that I'm using, and oral histories are in dialogue with these personal archives because they're often filling in the gaps and giving context to them. So I suppose in many ways the silences are around, it's a good question, because I think you're right. These archives speak to what was important to the people who collected them, and that's why I suppose we can't only rely on them. I think the advantage of working with living people is that we have the opportunity for oral histories, and we have the opportunities to get more information. And I mean, Adrien can probably speak to this more. I know Adrien's project is going to the present, but for that earlier period, all you've got is the institutional archive, and that's that extra challenge. So I don't think that's done your question justice, Katie. I think I need to reflect more, but the short answer is it's not just this, it is all these other pieces coming together.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that. It strikes me that kind of the scrapbook is a curation project, as it were, and it's a bit like an autobiographical project as well, and the nature of autobiography is also, you know, telling a narrative arc, for example, about a life. It's just
it's a great one. And actually, just to quickly respond to that extra one, the person who curated this 41 scrapbooks, I've been in touch with them, and we are hopefully going to do an interview. We were in touch pre-COVID. They're up in Brisbane, trying to follow up, see if we can get a Zoom interview. But again, it's that point of the scrapbook itself is remarkable. We can speculate, but if we can put it in dialogue with oral history, that adds even more layers to it. Sorry, Adrien, if you were going to say something.
Not specifically. I didn't.
Yeah. And Julie has her hand up.
I would just add that there were actually things in terms of that silences that I didn't share with there was another filing cabinet in the other side of the room, which for me, I just had far too much personal diaries, which I just felt I wasn't ready to share. But I haven't destroyed them, and they're still there. And actually, I do know a lot of I have met a lot of trans women who've once they've transitioned and moved on and they've actually destroyed all their archives because they felt that it would reveal too much about them in the future.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, I was actually wondering about that. If there are other archives out there that have been destroyed as people got older because they feared, their family discovering them or so on. Do we have any other questions for Adrien or Noah? No. Really? Was that you went back?
No. I just wanted to say I really enjoyed seeing both of them. Where one was based on personal archives and one based on public archives. I actually thought that was a really great way to have this session. Actually, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Adrien if, obviously, the constraints of the archive are such that you're having to heavily rely on kind of state official, records in, moments when the surveillance of the state intersected with these kind of gender non-conforming lives. But are there any examples of more personal writings that survive from this period, or is there just kind of nothing?
There's a couple for sort of female masqueraders and stuff like that. There's an autobiography written by I think it was Marion Bill Edwards.
Yeah.
There's like a couple of things like that. There's not a whole lot that I've come across yet. My research as well, so I'm going into it's sort of a broad overview across the 20th century. So I'm sort of moving up through the decades as I go along. So I'm coming across more and more. Sorry, my alarm's just going off. I'm coming across more and more stuff sort of as I move closer into the present, and also going into oral history interviews when I can. But yeah, for the early period, it is sort of quite difficult to find people talking about their own experiences and their own identities, and there's sort of a lot of trying to have to fill in those gaps and find cases where, as I was sort of saying, we can't sort of necessarily, speak to any particular person's experience or own perception of themselves or their own gender and things like that, but sort of have to rely on state archives and things like that, which is a bit unfortunate. But hopefully, as we move forward further into the later decades and stuff, we sort of start seeing more and more from people talking about their own identities and their own experiences.
Thanks. Any final questions? I just wanted to end by, I suppose, kind of asking each of you, Noah and Adrien, I suppose, what your thoughts about the kind of the present and the future of trans history in Australia. Because as I kind of gestured towards at the beginning, it's a kind of thriving field, and there's been a lot of work being done at the moment, including, here, your work. I suppose, where do you see it going kind of internationally, and particularly in Australia over the next few years?
No. Do you want to have a shot at it, Noah?
Oh, I go first.
30 seconds or less,
Well, look, one thing that I've noticed from interviewing so many people, so coming back to the oral histories, is there is a lot of interest, especially within the trans and gender diverse communities, because, well, kind of like that last quote that Jonathan said of, like, we need these histories told and preserved. Historians shouldn't predict the future, you know that. I think there is growing...
the future.
I know. Look, I think one thing that is happening, and part of, what brought me to this project was doing this work in defense, and one thing that was really clear was you couldn't understand trans people in defense without knowing this broader history, which hadn't really been comprehensively recorded and documented, and that's what really brought me to this project and working with trans people in this project. And so I think for that reason, and, you know, whether it be sport, or whether it be in academia or in particular institutions, or even religion has come into this. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Joe Inkpen. I mean, all of these institutions where trans people always have been a part of them. The history really does inform that, but there hasn't been enough attention to that. And so I think that there is more interest in it. I'm certainly seeing more honors theses on the topic. I think we're seeing more interest in separating out the T from the LGBTI acronym. And I don't say that in a bad way. I mean, they are distinct. So I like to think there will be more of this. There you go. That was probably longer than 30 seconds.
Good, fascinating. And Adrien, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, like I guess sort of on a similar sort of note, I think people are getting more interested, and I think people are getting more sort of keen to share their own journeys and their own histories and things like that, which is positive. And I was sort of, I don't know, I've been thinking a bit lately about sort of, you know, how as a trans person we often sort of lose a lot of our history and things like that, and it does. I don't really know what it says to the future of the field, but like I think there is sort of a lot of the time where you know, trans histories are often sort of suppressed or have been historically, and I think it's good to sort of see more and more of it coming out, and hopefully getting more and more attention. But yeah, I don't know where things will be going. Hopefully we'll get more and more. We can keep building on everything that people are putting out there, and yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think I was thinking about this earlier this evening, that, you know, perhaps part of that kind of craving for a sense of lineage and a kind of, you know, trans family stretching back through time is related partly to the, you know, way in which many trans people have difficult or estrained relationships with their biological families, you know, as, you know, all LGBT people sometimes do. Great. Well, we might end the formal proceedings then. There. Could you join me in thanking Noah and Adrien again for two really wonderful papers? We can all do our virtual clapping emoji. Spirit fingers. I really enjoyed both of them, and I'm looking forward to seeing more outputs, as the ARC would say, from this project very soon. So I'll end the recording now, but as I mentioned at the start, we'll leave the Zoom on for a few more minutes if anyone just, you know, wants to have a chat. Or otherwise you're free to go and enjoy the rest of your evening. Okay, thank you so much for coming.
And thanks for being on.